Hi. Hi everybody. Selamat datang semuanya. Selamat malam di Indonesia, selamat pagi yang di Amerika. Kita pada hari ini kedatangan tamu spesial, Profesor Michael Dodds dari Dominican School of Philosophy and Theology di Graduate Theological Union at Berkeley. So saya akan berbahasa Inggris. Welcome everybody to Theovlogy number 199, I believe. And today we have a special guest, Professor Michael Dodds from DSPT Berkeley, part of Graduate Theological Union Consortium. So let me give you a brief introduction of Father Michael. I have his CV here, which is only about 13 pages long. And I'm sure it's actually a lot longer than this brief one that he has. So Father Michael did his studies actually from California, St. Albert's College in Oakland, a bachelor's, and then did his MA and MDiv from the Dominican school. So in a way, he returns home. And he went to Fribourg, Switzerland for his doctorate. And since then has traveled to Germany as a visiting scholar and also part of the Blackfriars Hall in Oxford, England. He has written extensively, many books, many articles. One book which we will discuss here, which got him the award of the degree, the honorary degree of STM, which is, I believe, is the higher ecclesiastical degree. Father, you can correct me, from the ecclesiastical pontifical system. Father Michael has acted as a professor, as theology department chair, philosophy department chair, and even academic dean at the Dominican school. So we are very, very honored to have Father Michael Dodds talk to us about how Thomism, St. Thomas Aquinas from the Middle Ages, has a lot to say about the contemporary discussion in theology and science with regards to divine action in relation to quantum mechanics, but also other scientific theories such as chaos theory, emergence, and so forth and so on. Welcome, Professor Michael Dodds.
Well, thank you very much. Very good to be with all of you, and thank you for your invitation. So I'm going to, shall I start my talk? I'm going to give you a little talk, some words about Thomas Aquinas and quantum mechanics and science, and see, and my theory is that Thomas Aquinas has a lot to say about contemporary issues in theology, and especially the theology science discussion. So the book of Genesis, as you know, opens with the words, "In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth." These words, I think, teach us two things about God: that God exists and that God acts. But to act is to do something, to cause something. To talk about divine action, we therefore need a language of causality. If we have a rich language of causality, we can have a nuanced conversation about God's action. But if our language of causality gets cramped and constricted, we become, I think, theologically tongue-tied when we try to talk about divine action. And I think that's just what happened with the advent of modern science. The classical philosophy of Aristotle and Thomas Aquinas had a broad, nuanced notion of causality. But with the coming of modern science, that concept became constricted or locked in. Newtonian science used a mathematical method for investigating the world, and so tended to ignore all aspects of reality that were not measurable. Since a divine cause is not measurable, there is simply no place for it in the natural world. So Albert Einstein explains this. He says, "The more a man is imbued with the ordered regularity of all events, the firmer becomes his conviction that there is no room left by the side of this ordered regularity for causes of a different nature. For him, neither the rule of human nor the rule of divine will exists as an independent cause of natural events." Today, the discoveries of contemporary science have again broadened the notion of causality, unlocking the discussion of divine action by giving theologians two new ways to talk about it. One is to use the discoveries of science themselves in theology, and the second is to use the broadened notion of causality that such discoveries entail. So we're going to look at both options. We'll start with what we might call the classical notion of causality, which proposed 4 fundamental causes. Any change involves these 4 causes. As an example, we might take the change of a block of clay into a statue. It entails something that endures through the change, the clay, and something new that comes to be, the shape or form of the statue. It calls what endures through the change matter, or the material cause, and Aristotle names the new actuality form, or formal cause. The formal cause explains why a substance exists as a particular kind of thing. The material cause accounts for why it can cease to be what it is and become something else. Change also requires an agent or an efficient cause, like the artist who shapes this clay, and a purpose or a final cause. The artist, for instance, would not bother to shape the clay unless she had some end or goal in mind, perhaps to produce something beautiful or perhaps to make some money. The final cause is that for the sake of which something is done. It's designated by the Greek word telos, and the study of final causality is known as teleology. Aristotle and Aquinas saw final cause operative not just in intelligent agents, but also in agents that lack intelligence. The hallmark of classical causality is ontological dependency. As Aquinas says, those things upon which others depend for their being or becoming are called causes. Causality is an analogous notion that can be employed in a number of ways. The artist is the cause of the statue, but so are the matter out of which it is made, the form into which it is shaped, and the purpose or goal in the mind of the artist. The notions of matter and form are found in both accidental change and substantial change. In accidental change, like the making of a statue, a certain substance, like clay, endures through the change and undergoes some accidental or incidental modification, like acquiring a new shape, an accidental form. In substantial change, the substance itself changes and becomes a different substance. When a dog dies, for instance, it ceases to be a dog and becomes a different substance. Since the substance itself, that is the dog, is changing, it cannot be a substance that endures through the change, but it must be some more fundamental principle, more fundamental than substance. Aristotle calls this principle primary matter. It's not itself a substance, but the mere possibility of being a substance. What actualizes it is not some accidental form like a shape or a structure, but a substantial form, understood as the principle or cause by which a thing is what it is. When the dog dies, for instance, primary matter ceases to have the substantial form of dog and comes to have new substantial form. Perhaps you could say the form of the dog carcass, or perhaps the substantial forms of the more basic substances that make up the carcass, carbon, calcium, and so on. We tend to think of causality or action mostly in terms of efficient cause, the agent of change. Aristotle and Aquinas, however, ascribed the notion of action not only to the efficient cause, but also to the formal and final causes. In Aquinas' understanding, to act means to make something to be in act. This can happen in a number of ways. If an artist shapes a block of clay into a ball, for instance, we can say that the artist, the efficient cause, makes the clay to be round. But we can also say that the form of roundness makes the clay round. Because for all of the artist's squishings and swashings, the clay remains only potentially round until it actually possesses that form. We can also say that final cause, or the end, acts on the agent or moves the agent to act. For instance, if the artist works in order to make money, we can say that money, as the final cause, the good to be attained, induces the artist to act. Efficient causality may sometimes, but not always, be described in terms of quantitative force. The activity of an art student, for instance, may be specified in terms of how many pounds of pressure per square inch she exerts on the clay that she's shaping. The activity of the teacher who advises her, however, is also a type of efficient causality, but not one that could be described in terms of quantitative force. Formal and final causality, however, can never be described as quantitative force. Formal cause acts on the clay to make it actually round, but it doesn't act as a force. The clay is not actually round until it possesses the form or shape of roundness, and that form in some way makes it actually round, but it doesn't make it round by exerting any kind of force. It acts according to the mode of formal causality. Its action is quite different from the efficient cause, especially that efficient cause that we know as force. The final cause also acts on the agent to influence or induce it to act. If the artist works to make money, making money is in some way the cause of her action. But we cannot describe this influence in terms of quantitative force. The final cause acts, but it acts according to the mode of final causality as the end or good that induces the efficient cause to act. The mode of causality proper to final cause cannot itself be reduced to efficient causality, much less to the efficient cause that we call force. Well, this richly nuanced classical understanding of causality was lost with the advent of modern science, which had no place for causes that could not be quantified. Formal and final causes disappeared since they weren't measurable. The material cause was viewed as a principle of pure potentiality or possibility, but in modern science, it came to be viewed as the actual stuff of the universe, the atoms or ultimate particles of which all things are composed. The notion of efficient causality itself was also constricted, no longer broad enough to include both the artist and the teacher who advises her. It was conceived strictly in terms of forces or energy that move the atoms of the universe. Governed by inexorable laws, the world was seen as a deterministic realm that admitted no outside causes and was best studied by a method of reductionism that explained all phenomenon in terms of its most fundamental components. Well, contemporary science has opened new ways of understanding causality. We can see this in quantum mechanics, the theory of emergence, the Big Bang, and contemporary biology. Quantum mechanics, at least in the Copenhagen interpretation, envisions a world of spontaneity and points to a fundamental indeterminism at the heart of material reality. This notion of indeterminacy brings to mind Aristotle's material cause, not the actual stuff of the universe in Newtonian science, but a principle of sheer possibility. The theory of emergence claims that on many levels in the natural world, new features arise that can't be explained simply in reference to their parts. To study them, one must begin with the whole, that is, from the top down, rather than from the part, from the bottom up. Jonathan Powers argues, for instance, that there are several features of present-day theory of elementary particles which suggests that at certain levels of complexity, matter exhibits emergent properties and emergent laws which can neither be defined nor explained in terms of the properties and laws at lower levels of complexity. Emergence is even more evident in biology. According to John Polkinghorne, subatomic particles are not only not more real than a bacterial cell, they also have no greater privileged share in determining the nature of reality. This means that the bottom-up method of reductionism is no longer adequate to account for the phenomena that science observes in the world. There's room here for the Aristotelian notion of form as a non-reducible principle of causality that allows us to see complex entities in the natural world not as mere conglomerations of parts, but as truly unified wholes with their own proper characteristics and activities. The Big Bang Theory invites us to consider the intricacies and contingencies involved in the formation of the universe. If any one of myriad sets of variables had been slightly different, a universe capable of producing and sustaining human life might never have developed. An explanation of those intricacies is suggested by the anthropic principle, which introduces human beings into the equations. Somehow, the where-from of the universe in the interrelation of initial forces is intricately related to the where-to in the eventual emergence of life. Consideration of nature's where-to opens the way to looking again at purpose, Aristotle's final cause, as a category of explanation in the natural world. The notion of purpose also reappeared in contemporary biology. According to the biologist Francisco Ayala, he says, teleological explanations are appropriate in biology. Teleological explanations imply that the end result is the explanatory reason for the existence of the object or process which serves or leads to it. A teleological account of gills of fish implies that gills came to existence precisely because they serve for respiration. Teleological explanations in biology are not only acceptable, but indeed indispensable, he says. Potentiality, form, and final cause are modes of causality that are not measurable and so cannot come directly under the scientific microscope. What is studied and discovered in science, however, now seems to invite or possibly to require their consideration as categories of explanation. So how is all of this then related to divine action? Well, as our idea of causality narrowed, so did our ability to speak of divine action. As Keith Ward explains, the scientific worldview seems to leave no room for God to act, since everything that happens is determined by scientific laws. No room for God to act in the world. If causality can be thought of only as physical force, then divine causality must also be explained univocally in those terms. But when God's action is conceived as one more physical force in the world, it seems to interfere with the determined patterns of scientific law. So Gordon Kaufman wonders how God can intervene in the world without, as he says, violently ripping into the fabric of history or arbitrarily upsetting the momentum of its powers. If there's only one univocal brand of causality, God must subscribe to it, and so become just one more univocal cause alongside of creatures. But when two univocal causes are involved in the same action, the causality of one has to interfere or diminish that of the other. So as an example, if two people carry a table, the work is divided between them. They're involved in what we might call a zero-sum game. The more weight one lifts, the less there is for the other. And if one lifts the whole load, the other is left with nothing to do. Similarly, if we think of God as a cause like any other in the world, his causality will seem to be in competition with creatures. Again, we have a zero-sum game, where God and creatures appear to be in competition. Given this framework, not only does God's causality seem to interfere with creatures, but an omnipotent God must seem to rob creatures of their causality entirely. Some theologians therefore conclude that God's power must be limited if creatures are to retain any causality of their own. From the beginning of modern science, any theology which conceived God's causality univocally has necessarily tried to limit God's power in some way. Deism, for instance, teaches that God's action is limited to only the moment of creation. God did indeed make the world, but is no longer needed to explain its continued existence or activity. Some liberal theologians have maintained that God continues to act in the world in some sense, but they deny that God can act outside the laws of nature. So Friedrich Schleiermacher argued that as regards the miraculous, the general interests of science, more particularly of natural science, and the interests of religion seem to meet at the same point. That is, that we should abandon the idea of the absolutely supernatural. Rudolf Bultmann considered it inappropriate to view divine action as a cause which intervenes between the natural or historical or psychological course of events. Events in nature are so linked by cause and effect, he says, as to leave no room for God's working. To avoid divine interference, some theologians maintain that God's knowledge and power must be limited. Arthur Peacock argues that God's omniscience and omnipotence must be regarded in some respects as self-limited. John Polkinghorne thinks that the presence of chance in the world requires a limitation of divine power. God chose a world in which chance has a role to play, thereby accepting limitation of his power and control. Brian Hebelwaith believes that to make room for human freedom, God must limit both his power and his knowledge. We have to limit God's action if we believe that it would otherwise disturb or interfere with the causality of creatures and the nexus of scientific laws. And we will think that God's action must involve such a disturbance so long as we understand divine action as a univocal cause. But we'll have no other way to understand divine action if we view causality itself as a univocal notion. But why should we continue to think of causality so narrowly? Contemporary science suggests a wider notion of causality, which in turn opens broader ways for speaking of divine action. Contemporary science offers theologians, I think, two fundamentally new options to talk about God's action. One is to employ the new discoveries of science themselves in theology. The other is to use not the discoveries themselves, but the expanded notion of causality that they imply. The second option invites a retrieval of classical ideas of causality. So we'll look at both of these options. Now, some theologians have used the discoveries of science themselves in their discussion of divine action. As a couple of examples I'll give you. One is Robert Russell, who's my colleague at the GTU, Graduate Theological Union in Berkeley, and the founder of the Center for Theology and the Natural Science. He employs the indeterminism of quantum mechanics to show how God might act in the world and yet not interfere with natural causes. He names this with the acronym NIODA, which has become famous in Berkeley, NIODA, non-interventionist objective divine action. He explains that we can view God as acting in particular quantum events to produce indirectly a specific event at the macroscopic level, one which we call an event of special providence. Quantum mechanics allows us to think of special divine action without God overriding or intervening in the structures of nature. Another example is John Polkinghorne, who suggests that the openness and top-down causality of chaos theory may be understood in a way that leaves, as he says, room for divine maneuver. Despite their impressive use of the discoveries of contemporary science, such approaches are still hampered, I think, by a narrowly conceived understanding of the nature of causality. Their very efforts to locate divine action within the spaces that have become available in quantum mechanics and chaos theory suggests that they are still operating out of a univocal understanding of causality, in which divine action might interfere with the causality of creatures. Well, given contemporary developments in science, why should we continue to think of causality univocally? We've seen that science itself seems to be reaching beyond this limited understanding of causality towards a new appreciation of material, formal, efficient, and final causality in nature. If a wider understanding of causality is required in science, how much more is it needed in theology? By employing a broader notion of causality, we can unlock the discussion of divine action. A rich vocabulary for speaking of divine action, analogously, is available already in the classical notions of formal, efficient, and final causality. We've already seen how developments in contemporary science point to these causes, so that we can now use them in the discussion of divine action. God is the final cause of each creature. Since every action of the creature is for the sake of some real or apparent good, and each thing is good only insofar as it participates in a likeness of the supreme good, who is God, it follows that God himself is the cause of every operation as its end. As final cause, God is involved in the action of each creature. God doesn't interfere with that action, but is rather its source, since the creature would not act at all unless in some way it were moved by some good to be attained through its action. God is also the exemplar formal cause of all things. As the idea or exemplar in the mind of an artist is the source of a work of art, so God, as the first exemplar cause of all things, is the cause of all creatures. As the creative idea of the artist doesn't interfere with her art, but is rather its origin, so God, as the exemplar cause, doesn't interfere in the world of creatures, but is rather its source. God is also the first efficient cause. We don't mean this in the narrow sense of Newtonian physics. God's action is not a mathematically describable force that moves the atoms. Rather, God's efficient causality is that of the creator, the source of the being of each creature. And since being is the innermost principle of every creature, God is most intimately present to each creature. As Thomas Aquinas says, being is innermost in each thing and most fundamentally inherent. Hence, it must be that God is in all things and innermostly. God and creatures are not involved in a zero-sum game. As creator, God does not interfere with the world he has created. His causality doesn't diminish the causality of creatures, but is rather its source. He manifests his power by giving to each creature its own proper power to act. As the writing on a chalkboard is due entirely to the chalk and to the person who's using the chalk, so the actions of creatures, insofar as they have being and actuality and perfection, are due entirely to God and entirely to the creature. As Aquinas says, it is apparent that the same effect is not attributed to a natural cause and to divine power in such a way that it is partly done by God and partly done by the natural agent. Rather, it is wholly done by both, but in different ways. God doesn't act in the world as one univocal cause among other causes, like one table carrier among others. God is rather the ultimate, the transcendent cause. For this reason, God's action doesn't diminish the contingency or the freedom of the creature, but is its source. God doesn't deprive creatures of their causality, but rather he gifts them with their causality. As Aquinas says, God not only gives things their form, but he also preserves them in existence and applies them to act, and is moreover the end of every action. God acts through the creature and its nature without meddling or interfering. But God can also, of course, do miracles. God can cause events in the world that are beyond the capacity of creatures. But even here, God does not disturb the world. God does not act against nature, but rather beyond nature, since the most profound order of the world is its ordering towards God. So we can come now to a blessed conclusion here. Since our notion of divine action is tied to our concept of causality, our idea of causality affects our view of God's action. Our idea of causality, however, has been profoundly influenced by empirical science. Classical philosophy provided a rich account of causality in terms of material, formal, efficient, and final causes. Modern Newtonian science reduced this to efficient and material causes conceived as the force that moves the atoms. Contemporary science has broadened the notion of causality through the influence of quantum mechanics, emergence, Big Bang theory, the anthropic principle, and contemporary biology. This new understanding of causality is reminiscent of the four causes of classical philosophy. As causality was constricted in modern science to the univocal notion of the force that moves the atoms, so were the ways in which theology was able to speak of divine action. Ultimately, it seemed that God could not act in the world at all, since there was simply no room for God to act without interfering with the causality of creatures. As contemporary science has expanded our understanding of causality, it has also increased the ways available for speaking of divine action. The affinities of the new understanding of causality in science with that of classical philosophy seem to invite a retrieval of the classical notion of causality, which promises to be helpful both in empirical science and the philosophy of nature and in the theology of divine action. We may find here a key to unlock the notion of causality, allowing us to affirm God's action in the world, God's intimate presence in all creation, and God's providential care for all things. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Father Michael, for the very dense but also clear, surprisingly clear, in terms of how you present the discussion from the Aristotelian four causes that are kind of locked in by classical physics, by Newton, and that to just material and perhaps efficient causes. And then contemporary physics tries to expand these notions as well to try to include material causes in Big Bang and quantum indeterminacy and some even final causation and the notion of top-down emergence and even in evolution itself in biology. But I think in the end you're saying contemporary science is not liberal, it's not liberating enough in the sense that divine causation should be beyond even these contemporary ideas, if I understand you correctly, because God is not just another cause in a univocal sense. So I think what you're proposing is beyond what contemporary science is offering by making a distinction between the primary and the secondary causes, being God being the ultimate source of our selves as agents of causation, so to speak. Now, with that, if I framed your talk correctly, my question is: can we still hold on to this idea of primary and secondary causation? That with humans, I think it totally makes sense that we have some agency in terms of creating causations. However, we no longer have the notions of natural appetites of a stone falling down, which Aquinas took from Aristotle. That idea of it kind of disappeared. So do you think it still works somehow, this framework of secondary causation for inanimate beings?
Yes, I mean, it's a very broad notion, either in metaphysics or the philosophy of nature, the secondary causality, and it tries to ensure, secure the causality of the creature, the secondary cause, while not eliminating the causality of God, and seeing that also as essential. So how to frame this? You could say that in any action at all that occurs, whether natural agents or intelligent agents, there's always something achieved through the action, Otherwise, we wouldn't recognize it as an act. So there was some possibility of achieving something, even if it's just a new location, something like that, or a state of equilibrium, say in an atom, an electron goes to this orbit, and so the atom is stable. Not at the natural place, but a condition that achieves a certain actuality. Well, the individual agent is acting according to its nature so that this situation comes about or is actualized. And that's due to the causality of the particular created agent. It's more evident, I suppose, in the biological world. Fish swim upstream, the salmon to spawn, and so on. There are all kinds of biological activities that seem to achieve a state of actuality, and it's evident that the biological organism is the one achieving that state. Well, where's God in all of that? Well, Aquinas understands God as pure actuality, the source of all actuality, the ultimate source. But that doesn't mean that God zeroes in each place and pokes in some actuality and ignores the creature or the secondary agent. God has created the world so that creatures themselves are the agents in bringing about those new actualities. And that would be secondary causality, and in that sense, universal in the world as we know it. Creatures are actually achieving all kinds of things all the time, and it's because of their actions that we can study them in science, whether it's in chemistry or biology or whatever. They are agents in some way, achieving things, new states of actuality. But God isn't absent from those situations. God is present. But God's present doesn't rob the creature of its own causality. It's rather the source of that causality. So I think the discussion of primary and secondary cause is still very important. And in some ways, it is, you're right, I think you might say it's beyond the compass of empirical science. If empirical science is dealing simply, according to its method, with quantifiable reality, well, in some cases, I suppose you can quantify primary and secondary causes, but not always. So in some ways, you could say science is pointing to these ways of understanding the natural world, even though those ways of understanding the world surpass the strict limits of empirical science itself. I think what it invites is a realm beyond empirical science, a realm of study or inquiry, which isn't yet theology or revelation, but philosophy, and specifically the philosophy of nature that can look at the world in broader ways than the restricted method of natural science. Because of its restricted method, of course, science has achieved a lot by sticking to a quantitative analysis of the real world. We have advancements in technology and so on. Philosophy comes along to answer broader questions. There's a saying that we first began to philosophize when we first asked useless questions. So those useless, broad questions that are still intriguing and still important in understanding nature in broader ways. But I think what's exciting, at least to me now, is that science, having been constricted by the Newtonian account of things, seems to be pointing, at least, in that direction of a broader understanding of nature.
Yeah, thank you, Father. I think you reminded me that formal causes and final causes do not have to have actual entities that are measurable in science, so the effects might be measurable. So that actually leaves some room for secondary causation without diminishing or competing with God as a primary causal agent. I think before I give more comments, probably I'll open it up to Professor David Alinuddin from SAR, and also Anga, who's a scientist here.
Yeah, thank you, Father Michael, for your presentation. I would like to ask about problem of evil. How can this Aquinas causality explain about problem of evil? Is
So
God
the problem with evil?
source of evil?
Is that right? You're asking a question about theodicy?
Yes.
Problem of evil? Yes, well, about, as President Obama said, that's above my pay grade. No, it's, I don't know, in any theology or in any philosophy, that problem remains a question, of course. And I think none of these approaches in philosophy or theology, different theologies, find an answer to that question as such. Some answer it, I suppose, by say, well, we've got to bite the bullet and say that God is not as powerful as we thought God was. And God would like to do something about evil, but is simply unable to do that. And that solves the problem of evil, but it causes a much bigger problem for theology. How does God guarantee the eschatological triumph of good over evil if it's all up for grabs, you know, and God's doing his best every day, but it can't achieve what God wants to achieve because he's in some way limited, and some say limited by nature, like process philosophy, process theology, and some say limited by choice. But in any case, you can say you solve the problem of theodicy there, but you cause bigger problems for Christian faith. So in this approach with primary causality and secondary causality, God is involved in every event of causation, which is aimed towards some actuality, some instantiation of being. And being and actuality are, to the extent that they are being or actual, in some ways good. So God is involved in all of that. Well, how is God involved in evil? Well, here we could move to a kind of metaphysical level and say, well, what is evil? Is it a positive force in the world? Like in Star Wars, you have the dark side of the force that's just as powerful as the bright side or the light side of the force. Or, I mean, back to St. Augustine, trying to figure out what is the nature of evil, and thought evil isn't itself a positive force, like the Manichaeans thought. Evil is rather the absence of good, the absence of something. And that absence is sometimes horrendous. You can think of in human life, in human society, there could be an absence of justice. Well, it's something lacking that should be there in the quality of human actions, but it's not nothing in the sense of it's a matter of indifference. It's something horrible, but it doesn't consist in a positive sort of a being of its own. It's rather a lack of being. So in that sense, God doesn't need to be present for the instantiation of non-being, for nothing. And it doesn't solve the problem of theodicy. It does clarify certain things and keep us from making certain mistakes, like becoming dualist with the force of good and the force of evil in the world as such. It does allow us to maintain the conviction that creation is fundamentally good. God saw all that he had created and saw that it was good. Why God creates a contingent world in which things come to be and cease to be? I suppose even in the Garden of Eden, there was fruit on the trees, and the couple could eat of all of the fruit of all of the trees except this one. Well, we don't get to know, what did the tree think about that? you know, in The Wizard of Oz, the tree gets very upset when Dorothy comes along and picks something off of it and starts to eat it. So what is that? You know, there is a contingent world, and God, the creator, the provident, created a world in which there's not just this marble necessity where nothing changes and everything is crystal all the time. No, it's a world of change, and change always involves the corruption of one thing, the beginning of another. And that's the world God made. And this contingent world that God made is a good world. Very good, God says. So I think we have to look at the contingency of things as also a good. But there's the question then, why that? You know, maybe think I could dream up a better world where there wouldn't be tsunamis and all kinds of things like that. Well, yeah, that's why this world, though, I think is a question that we don't get an answer to. You know, at some point we just rely on the goodness of God, the providence of God, and God's directing all things again towards some end, which it's not a purposeless world, but a world which finds its purpose in ultimately for us anyway, our ultimate union with God. So yeah, no, I can't answer the problem of theodicy. I think though there is a way of addressing it within this philosophy of primary and secondary causes, but the problem of theodicy would be there no matter what theology one is using.
Okay, thank you.
Father Michael, I have a question. As I heard from your presentation, I heard that God causes, but God is also the purpose of everything that is. That's what I heard from you. I'm wondering how Thomas Aquinas would say about the Trinity and the Trinitarian persons, because I think divine action cannot be separated from the three persons acting together. I'm asking you because I remember when you were presenting, like Duns Scotus said that Christ is the primacy of everything. Does that relate with
Christ is the
Aquinas?
primacy of everything? Well, certainly that is a, first and last and so on. Christ is the primacy of God's action in the world is through Christ and the incarnation, redemption, and so on. But that's not an idea of Aquinas. That goes way back to the beginning of Christian faith, I think, the primacy of Christ. And certainly you find that in Aquinas also. With God's action in the world, there is a kind of a theological principle that you have a distinction of persons within God. So Father, Son, and Holy Spirit are distinct from each other within the one divine being of God, ad intra, within God. But then some would say that ad extra, with respect to events that happen beyond God or God's action outside of God's self, then God acts from the oneness of the divine essence. But theologians have said, well, no, we can't just ignore the Trinity when it comes to that either, because God is always a Trinity. So Gilles Emery is a Thomistic theologian who's done a lot of work on the Trinity, and one of it is one of his books is the Trinitarian creation. So that is that the three persons of the divine Trinity are there also in the act of creation, as the Son is from the Father and the Spirit from the Father and the Son. So also in creation, the three persons are acting as well. We don't just say it's the divine essence that acts, because the divine essence isn't anything other than the three divine persons. So it has to be the three persons acting in such a way that creation is achieved. So, and then as far as God being the purpose or the end or final cause of all things, the final cause, the mark of final causality is goodness. We do something because it is good, or at least because it looks good to us. Sometimes we get into trouble that way when sinful actions look good in the moment, but they are not really. But still we choose them under the aspect of goodness. So God is the ultimate true good. God is, you might say, doesn't have goodness simply as an attribute the way a saint might have goodness in their life, but is goodness. Aquinas says everything in God is God. So if we talk about wisdom being in God, God simply is wisdom. Or truth being in God, God simply is truth. Or goodness is in God, well, God simply is goodness. Well, in that way, divine goodness is the heart of the whole creation and so on. So the ultimate goodness itself, is then reflected in all those participations in goodness that we experience. And so God is present in all of those events. So I think in terms of speaking of divine presence or divine action, reintroducing the idea of final cause or goodness itself as a cause allows us to have a new way of experience or seeing, talking about the presence of God in creation and in all that creatures are doing.
Father Michael, so I think two questions. The first is this concept it has something to do with Augustine's concept of order? Because Augustine himself, from what I read, he has this concept of order, that everything is ordered in such a way, and everything is in order because of God and for God. And the second is, from the way you put it in your presentation, that all causation come from God, and the telos is also for God. And just now you explained it's for the true goodness of God. Then, and where does that put revelations? Does that mean God can be revealed from normal everyday circumstances with God's presence in those kind of events? Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Well, certainly order is a mark of creation. God didn't create a chaos, where there isn't any recognition of any kind of order. Everything is disordered. But we see an order, and we express that in different ways. It could be the theologian reflecting on the order of the universe as a sign of divine wisdom behind the universe, or it could be the scientist looking at the order of the atom, say, and trying to figure out what is the source of that order on the natural level, what scientific laws are involved in that, how do we conceive it, but there is a recognition of order, and which is not, which is understandable, because if the creation is the work of the Trinity, well, then the Word, the Logos, is there evident in the work of creation. So it's a work of wisdom. And being a work of wisdom, then with revelation, the heavens proclaim the glory of God. So creation expresses the beauty of God. And all of creation is in some ways a revelation of God's goodness and of God's presence as well. Aquinas formalizes that at the beginning of his Summa with his 5 ways of showing that God exists, or 5 proofs, it's sometimes said, for God's existence. But each of them begins with some natural phenomenons. The first one starts with change, and the second one with efficient causality, the third one with contingency, or the fifth one with order in the universe, and the fourth one with degrees of goodness that we find in the world. Well, all of these are aspects of creation, but the different aspects of creation all point to the divine reality, even to the extent that Aquinas can say he finds a principle or a cause at the conclusion of each of those arguments, and then names that cause as the reality that everyone calls God. He doesn't say, therefore I proved to you that there is God, but I proved to you that there is a reality, and that reality is the reality everyone calls God. So that's one revelation, that creation itself can reveal the reality of God. But in addition, of course, God can reveal God's self, and that's what we find in Scripture and the story of God's in the history of His people in the Old and New Testament. The ultimate revelation of God in that way is this revelation in Christ. The one who has seen me has seen the Father. So how could there be a deeper, truer revelation than that? The divine love incarnate, so that we can look at the love of Christ or the heart of Christ and see the heart of God. Yeah, so it's amazing. God creates the world and wants to bring the world to himself and communicates with us in the world as well, in ways that go beyond what we could discover. By exploring the natural world, we might discover the goodness of God or even the existence of God. But some aspects of God we wouldn't find on our own, like the Trinity itself, for instance. I don't think we discover that on our own, but that's a revelation that God gives us. Or humans finding themselves in a mess from the beginning, and how do they get out of it? Well, then there's another revelation of God in Christ, that God is the one who delivers us from our own sinfulness. But that's, again, a revelation. We wouldn't come up with the idea of God becoming human, hypostatic union, without the revelation itself from God, that Jesus is truly God. And how do we talk about that? Yeah, so there is we're not dealing with a deist God who is miles away and so removed that has nothing to do with the world, but a God who's intimately involved in the world at each place, in each moment.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Father Michael, if we compare the Aquinas causality with 4 kinds of relationship that Ian Barber present, there is independence, conflict between science and religion, independence, conflict, dialogue, and integration. Am I right if I say that the relationship between science and religion that is presented by Aquinas causality is like independence, because God's causality and secondary causality is no overlapping? Is it right?
I see, yes. Well, in Barber's analysis with independence, it really means that science and theology have nothing to do with each other. So there could never be a dialogue or a conflict between them. It's like they're on separate tracks and they never meet, which wouldn't be the case with Aquinas in his understanding of the natural world. At the time he was alive, the medieval world had rediscovered the science, the physics of Aristotle, and he didn't want to ignore that, even though some saw it as a conflict. Some of Aristotle's ideas seemed to be in conflict with Christian theology. Aristotle, for instance, thought that the world had always been in the past. Well, Christians believed there was a moment of creation. So some Christians at Aquinas' time weren't interested in that. But Aquinas was interested in truth wherever it could be found. And there was a lot of truth in Aristotle's philosophy. So he studied that philosophy and the Islamic commentators on Aristotle, and the Jewish commentator as well, Maimonides, to discover the depth of truth that was there. So he wouldn't go for the kind of independence sort of approach where one has nothing to do with the other, nor with the notion of conflict where science and religion are at war with each other. Certainly, I would think he would be into the notion of dialogue. There would be an exchange between science discovers about the natural world and what theology can know about the world through revelation, and that those two are not in conflict but mutually enriching. As we discover more of the natural world, we discover more deeply the presence of God in the world. So I think he would be in the camp with dialogue. And then the beyond dialogue, the idea, what's the fourth one again?
Integration.
Integration, yes. Integration depends on how you do integration, huh? So I think there's a way to do integration, which just means a kind of a deeper dialogue, which is good. But sometimes integration, at least in the way it gets parsed out, seems to be that, well, science sets the agenda and you kind of integrate theology alongside of it. So you have not a natural theology, but theology of nature. But the accent is on the nature, and science is telling what the nature of things is, and then you kind of fit theology in alongside, you know. So it depends on how that integration is done, whether it be something that Aquinas would subscribe to or not. If it means simply a deepening of the dialogue, yeah. If it means that you integrate theology into a scientific view of the world, theology of science, such that you have to abandon certain aspects of your theology belief, then I suppose not.
So I can conclude that Aquinas' causality is more dialogue, than independence.
Yes, that's what
It's
I
more
think.
like dialogue. Yeah. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, see, Aquinas would say that there can never be a conflict between the truth of revelation and the truth of reason or of science. But it's not because they're on separate tracks and have nothing to do with each other. It's because they both stem from the one source of all truth, which is God. So God created the world, and the world reflects God. And if we know truly about how the world is working, then that can't conflict with what God tells us in Revelation, because they're both from that one source of truth. And it's not, they can't conflict with each other, not because they're on separate tracks and have nothing to do with each other, as in the model of independence, but it's because they're so tightly knit together, having their source in the one source of all truth, which is God.
Yes, I agree.
Father Michael, I have a question building on what Anga has asked you, and you mentioned that God is so intimate and God is present. Now the question is, what about the question of impassibility and impassibility of God? Does that mean that God's action is affected by human action and what is happening in nature? How would you take on that?
Yes, no, that's another big topic in contemporary theology, of immutability of God or impassibility of God. And as soon as you say the word impassible, you think of a rock or a chunk of cold marble, indifferent, uncaring, and so on, you know, like an iceberg. And then if that's what impassibility means, well, then that isn't what we want to ascribe to God. There was a book, The Divine Relativity by a process theologian, that I used as kind of springboard for my own doctoral studies. And his whipping boy was Thomas Aquinas, that he said, oh, those crazy things Aquinas says, and God unrelated to the world. And I thought, well, that can't be the case, you know? So I wrote a dissertation on divine immutability, but using what Aquinas did to show there are all kinds of ways that the term immovable or unchangeable can be used. Some are good, with love is not love that alters when it alteration sees, as Shakespeare says. So love has to have an abidingness in some ways, and that abidingness of love, that unchangingness of love in that sense, is a good thing, you know. But there are other immovable things in nature too that seem to be lower forms of life, like sort of rocks and so on. Well, when we're using God talk, we have to use the three ways of causation. We talk about God as the cause of things, but also negation. Whatever is lacking in creatures, we have to deny of God, even to say that God is not good in the way that the limited creature has goodness. And eminence. So what we see of goodness in creatures, we predicate in an eminent way of God. So the same with when it comes to immutability, it would have to be what we see in creatures as the admirable kind of unchangingness is the kind of unchangingness we want to apply to God. And we'd have other reasons for doing that as well, metaphysical reasons, or even theological reasons. I am God and I do not change, Malachi, and so on. So that's one, the larger topic, immutability, but then impassability. And it also seems like if God is caring, God must be affected by the world. One of the church fathers says God is not affected, God is affection, which is kind of nice. You know, it isn't as if God is sitting back from the world and then kind of woken up when something's going on in the world and responds to it and is affected by what's going on in the world. Say that God is so intimately present at each moment that the very notion of response makes God too remote, or the very idea of God being affected by the world is too remote. It makes God too passive and then wakes up because of what's going on in the world. It also, I mean, it has the advantage of being understandable because it's the way that we're affected by things, the way that we know that we're involved and we're not apathetic. If we're affected, we're passible. That's our nature. But you know, I think it's not always good to understand God in terms of the limits of human nature, that God would be like us. We can say that we are like God. We reflect divine goodness, but we don't want to bring God down to our level of being or even our level of intimacy. We have relationship with one another, but in some ways that relation itself is between us. We're beside one another and related in one way or another. God is more intimately present than that. Nothing stands between God and creation. So that results then in a confession of God's impassibility. We use that word. God isn't affected by the world, not because God is so indifferent or distant, but because God is so intimately present that the word's response or affectedness don't grasp the intimacy of God. They put God too much at a distance.
Well, thank you. Father Michael, we have questions here.
Okay.
Liverpool 9 fan. You mentioned in your talk that miracles don't disturb the world, they're beyond nature. But when a miracle happens, does it not mean that the normal law of science is violated? I mean, because most science is based on patterns, then a few cases of violation shouldn't cancel the validity of natural science.
No, I don't think that. I mean, lots of philosophy of science now is written on the nature of the laws of science, and they don't seem to be quite the way these inexorable decrees, you know. They are found to be applicable in certain situations. Given these conditions, this will be the case. So there are limits to the laws of science first. I don't think that it's a good way to describe miracles as a violation of the laws of science. Aquinas says that God's action in a miracle is not contrary to nature, but is beyond nature. So again, not contrary to the laws of science or a violation of the laws of science, but beyond the laws of science and their description of reality. So I agree with you that given the nature of the laws of science, a few cases of quasi-violation of the laws of science don't cancel the validity of the natural world. You know, the whole fabric of time-space will not be torn apart if God, Christ, changes water into wine or something. Huh? These are miraculous events that are certainly possible. God isn't limited to the natures that God created in the world. God is beyond them, can act beyond them, always for some purpose, usually for instruction of some sort, or revelation, like the revelation of the Christ through the signs that he worked, or revelation of God's deliverance in the Old Testament through the events that surround the Exodus. So those things are certainly possible, but the question is whether the best way to describe miracles would be a violation of the laws of science. I think it gives too much weight to the laws of science themselves, with the way they're understood now as more limited approaches to the natural world. They're not prescriptive, determining what's going to happen in the world. They're rather descriptive. They notice what's happening in the world, and then they formulate it in a mathematical formulation of some sort. Force equals mass times acceleration, or something like that. But it's not because you have that law that things therefore move in these ways. It's because things move in certain ways, that there is this order intrinsic in the universe that it's ordered enough that one can eventually describe it in mathematical terms. But if you're doing your experiment, you have to make sure that you eliminate all other factors. You go to your lab and you isolate the experiment and so on. But in the natural world, all of these things are whizzing around all the time, So in some ways, the law of science is an abstraction. You're taking out particular detail and describing that, but it does work. But it works when other factors are set aside, So I think part of the wisdom of the philosophy of science now is to see the limits of science itself, and the limits of the laws of science.
I think because you said that God is not a univocal cause. God is not a univocal cause, so God's action is not violating the natural law. Is it right?
God is not a univocal cause, and therefore
because therefore God's action is not violating the natural law.
It's not violating natural law. Violating.
Because God is not.
Well, yes. So univocal cause would mean here is God and here is the nature, and it's zero-sum game. If nature acts more, God acts less. If God acts more, nature acts less, etc., back and forth, as if they're always in conflict. So to say God is not a univocal cause eliminates that mindset. One more nature, less God, more God, less nature. God doesn't belong to the same order of causality as other things in nature. So yes, then God can then act beyond nature. That's what you're getting at, miraculous action.
Yes, I think that's the answer.
No, okay. Wouldn't.
Is it right?
Yes, I think so. Wouldn't violate nature, but be beyond nature.
So I have a question about this notion of unrealized potential and randomness. I think Aquinas, following Aristotle, understands chance in physics book 2, I think. We can only know that it is a chance only because we compare it to something what it's supposed to do for the sake of something in terms of final cost. Only in terms of final cost that we can see something as random or something as a chance. And I think Aquinas does a similar move, though I don't know if that's the similar move that can be made with his theodicy as evil as a deprivation of what things are supposed to be. Whether there's a parallel here between a purposeful act and then randomness, and then something that is the ultimate good, and then there's evil. The two might be parallel, but if we conflate the two, then we run into the problem, then are unrealized potential and chaos in general evil? So what do you have to say about these two lines of thinking?
Well, I think, I would say that the only reason you recognize chance is because there is an order in the world. So if everything were chance, and chance were the primary reality, then you wouldn't even recognize chance, because you see a certain order, and then the where that ordered series of events is headed doesn't happen. How come? Well, because of some other cause that comes in and gets in the way and louses things up. But there's the each cause, you could say, is doing its own thing, moving its own way, and this one makes sense going this way, and that one makes sense going that way. But then they cross. This would be chance. The classical example: someone's going to the store to buy some candy bar, and someone else is going to get a Coke, and they're old friends. They haven't met in years, and suddenly their paths cross, and wow, what a good luck, we met today, look at that. So that's chance event, but you recognize chance because there is already some ordered event going on. So order is, you could say chance is parasitic on order. You first have to have the ordered thing, and then you can have the chance event. And now there is, of course, an order that I was talking about of all things directed to God as the ultimate good. And this is the order that God intends in creating the world. But there are free beings like you and I who can decide otherwise, not to follow the order that God has given us in our own human nature and how we should act in the world around us, but to act in other ways out of selfishness, greed, or whatever it is. Well, then we introduce disorder in the world, but I wouldn't want to equate that with chance, because with chance there isn't any kind of rational source behind it, at least on the natural level, that two people just ran into each other at the store, period, that just happened. Whereas if we're violating or going against the order that God gives us in God's law and revelation, then we're the cause, we're the ones doing the evil. So that wouldn't be chance. It would be a whole different reality. We're introducing something else into the world, a real disorder of evil, which then, the way evil works, it kind of multiplies also. It has consequences to our evil actions. So I think they're two different things. I'm not sure then that I find the parallel that you're drawing between the evil in the world as the world is directed towards God, or chance in terms of natural events being, or even human events having a certain direction, but something comes along to derail them or interfere with them, or it looks like something is making them intersect in a meaningful way when there wasn't any agency causing that intersection. Then we'd say that's chance.
Right, thank you. So I think you were making a difference between the notion of chance, where there is it is not disorder. It is an irregularity, but it is not a disorder. There's no intentionality in it, and in that sense, it is actually uncaused. I think Aristotle would say it is an incidental cause, but it's not a cause per se. Exactly. And therefore, there has to be an original cause, several other causes, which creates this coincidence to take place. And that is not what we see in your argument about the perception of evil, where there is a lack of order towards good, but it is an intentional disorder against order. So in that sense, evil is different than chance
Yes.
per se. Yes,
I think
that
so.
makes- Okay, thank you.
Uh-huh.
Should we bring in audience questions? Again, I think that Zoran has a lot of questions at Nindyo.
Okay, good.
Well, Arvin, would you read?
Yeah, I think the idea is that violation happens from that which is in the same order,
Oh,
and thus miracle being enacted from something or someone that exists in a transcendental nature above the laws that made it not violating then, merely like reprogramming things.
I think I agree with you that the idea of meaning of the different order is key here. So that God isn't violating the other order because the fundamental ordering of the natural world is towards God. So if God acts in a way that is beyond, say, the local activity of secondary causes, the local nature of things, water doesn't change itself into wine every day, then you do have a something happening beyond the local orderings, but without violating that. I agree with you there. I'm not sure how that is like reprogramming things in a kind of computer analogy there, but I'm just not sure how that works, or reprogramming things.
Right, and it continues here.
Okay, I'm into Evelyn Wood reading Dynamics. If you want to go back, Arvin, and read those off, that would be helpful.
Oh, I think you went too fast, Nindyo. Can you scroll back?
So, physically speaking, we're living in entropy, and someday in the far future, there will be a heat death. All right, agree with that. How, being a theologian, can we answer the problem of inevitability of decay and meaninglessness of the world is going in, especially with the fact that humans are largely responsible for the decay? Okay, yes, that's a moral question. That is to say, both in physical sphere and in the spiritual sphere, as we are continually transgressing God's commandments through and through since time immemorial. Okay. Yes. So it looks like there are two things going on there. One is just the world as we understand it, scientifically, Big Bang happened, and now you have an expansion of the world, and where is it going to end, in the dead heat of the universe or in another big crunch? And if it's dead heat, then how does that fit with eschatology and so on, in meaningful world, Well, if that's all there was atoms in the void and it's going nowhere, then yeah. But that isn't all there is. We live in a world that's temporal and contingent, and Scripture says the world is going to end, the second coming, and so on. So we know it's going to end in a supernatural way, the second coming, or perhaps a natural way. Either way, the world is this temporal reality, and the meaningfulness in the world is the meaningfulness that we find here and now, and our own directness to something beyond the world. If it is for this life only that we have lived, then we are the most hopeless of people. So yes, so there's the natural thing that's going to happen, but that I don't think is so terribly disturbing. More disturbing is the moral thing that human beings are now doing within the world. If we're set to be kind of the guardians or caretakers of the world, and we're destroying the world, that is a moral fault and could have, global consequences with global warming and so on. So there, I think we can find ways to take action locally or nationally and so on to, and then what we do in our elections and who we put in, who's going to be concerned about this issue, or in our own personal lives and trying to be conserving of nature and so on. So locally and globally, there is a response there to the destruction that humans themselves are causing in the world.
Yeah, I think there's another question here from Liverpool 9 fan. It says, has theology come up with a good explanation for the observer effect in quantum mechanics? This one.
Has theology come up with a good explanation of the observer effect? Well, I think it's beyond the realm of theology to discuss those details of quantum mechanics. You know, this would be does the Schrodinger's cat sort of thing, right? So
right.
the wave collapses when it's observed. So yes, and that's a way that scientists have of describing or puzzling about the natural world. But I do think there that I'd invoke kind of independence. Theology really has nothing to say about that detail of quantum mechanics.
Interesting. I wonder if I can I can draw from your work, Father Michael, to answer this question. For example, I think you have this notion that, following previous discussion about chance being secondary to some other causes, does it mean that, would you agree to say something along the lines of quantum indeterminacy, actually there's something determinate underneath it, kind of this Bohmian interpretation instead of Copenhagen, that we just did not know about, that these quantum indeterminacies are basically coincidental causes? I guess that would be maybe one way. I don't know if you would say something like that.
Yeah, no, I and that is my view. I've gone round and round with Bob Russell on this, you know. Is chance absolute chance, or is it, like Einstein says, a matter of our ignorance of the real causes involved? And so I think we've come to understand our different positions, but not having any conversion one way or the other. So yes, I think that would be true. And then maybe this observer effect in quantum mechanics is just a paradox that comes about because of a certain way that the quantum mechanics is being interpreted, you know. And if we patient and wait for a new interpretation, maybe this paradox of the observer effect would be resolved if we understood.
Right. So the second thing that came to mind, you mentioned, for example, that downward causation could be seen as some kind of a formal cause. Would an observer effect then on a quantum mechanical system can be considered as a formal cause? Now, I think I'm slightly concerned when I think you also said somewhere that formal cause is not necessarily something that is of a force.
Right.
So therefore, in that sense, probably it is not proper. But I think you have said in the past that downward causation is some kind of a formal cause.
Yes, and what I'm thinking when they talk about downward causation, they mean the causation of the whole upon the part, you know. Yeah. So if you're a reductionist, why is the giraffe doing what it does? Well, let's look at the atoms in the giraffe and then the molecules and then the cells and builds, and then we'll find out what the giraffe is up to. But downward causality, we begin with the whole and see how the whole organism is acting, and then that seems to explain the parts. The giraffe is hungry, and therefore it's moving its molecules across the plain over to a tree somewhere to find a few leaves to eat. So downward causality has to do with within a substance or within an organism, how the whole affects the part. And that's where formal causality comes in, because it explains the reality of the whole as a whole. Whereas emergence talks about the whole emerging from the parts and then having a reality of its own, but it doesn't have any ontological ground for that wholeness. And I think that's where formal causality gives us the ontological ground. So that's downward causality. The peeking in the box, or with the Schrodinger's cat, or observing where the particle lands on the screen and collapsing the wave function in that way would not be top-down causality. I think it would be efficient causality. One thing is affecting another thing. It's mysterious how simply the observer can affect the situation, you know. The electron is neither in this place nor that place until I observe it. And when I look at it, then it becomes in this place or in that place. How that works is a question, you know, because it doesn't seem like the observer is doing anything as an efficient cause, merely looking at the situation. But until the observer looks, science doesn't have any way of saying, is this a wave or is it a particle? Is it here or is it there? There's just a series of probabilities of where it might be. So what happens then is I suppose we see where it is. Toink. It's on this part of the screen. It shows up. Well, then something caused the mark on the screen. I suppose, you know, the photon decided to bonk, land there. That's the efficient cause. And I notice it. And as soon as I notice it, now I can describe the situation in a new way, no longer as probability, but as determined. But that's a distinction in my way of thinking or in my way of describing it. And before that, I was unable to name it specifically. How come? Because nature itself was undetermined and unspecific, or because my knowledge was undetermined. So one would be the Copenhagen interpretation, that the indeterminacy is there in nature as such. The other would be Einstein, that I can't get there yet because I can't understand all the factors in the situation.
Thank you, Father Michael.
All right.
Well, Father Michael, this is a very exciting conversation that we had.
Yes.
Thank you so much for stopping by at Theology and presenting your fruit of scholarship. So really appreciate that. And we hope that this is not the last time for you to come by and to talk to our...
Thank you very much. I appreciate very much the invitation and the great conversation we've had. It was really good. So I appreciate all of your work.
Thank you, Father Michael. And also thank you, Professor David and Anga, and also Dr. Arvin for some robust conversation that we have had.
Yes, thank you.
All right, friends, thank you so much. I think we are good to close the session. Thank you for the comments. Thank you for the questions that you have posed. See you next time.
Bye.
Bye.